The first time I noticed something was off. It wasn't anything loud or dramatic. It was just a quiet puddle forming near the old stone-lined trench behind my shed. A puddle that shouldn't have been there. My name is Caleb Morrison. I'm a retired Army Corps of Engineer Sergeant, and now, at 58, I find a strange sense of calm in simple routines, coffee at dawn, pruning the hedges, cleaning the rain gutters. But when I saw that water standing there unmoving under a blue sky, something deep inside me stirred. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 6 years, ever since I moved back into my late father's property after his passing. The house was modest, a craftsman ranch built solid and low, but the land it sat on was my real inheritance. Almost an acre sloping gradually surrounded by old native trees, and most importantly, a historic drainage channel carved before the HOA even existed. That trench had carried stormwater safely off this land for decades. My dad used to call it the property's artery, and now it was clogged like a vein filled with plaque. At first, I figured it was leaves or maybe a fallen branch, but as I stepped over the fence line to check the old outflow, I froze. There was a new wooden fence, tall untreated planks hastily nailed together cutting right across the ditch. It hadn't been there the week before. Someone had driven wooden stakes straight into the trench, damming it completely. Water was pooling fast, and the soil around the old magnolia tree had already started to sag. I followed the fence line until it brought me face to face with a freshly planted flower bed and a neatly carved wooden sign that read, HOA Beautification Initiative Do Not Disturb. I knew immediately who had done it. Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Ridge HOA. HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, former luxury real estate agent, lover of rules, and destroyer of common sense. Karen's backyard bordered mine. We had a respectful distance for years, me with my practical boots and work gloves, her with her spotless white sun hat and lavender trimmers, but I always suspected she saw my house as an eyesore. Too rustic, too much unmanaged earth. She once made a passive-aggressive comment at a block party about how certain homeowners preferred a more natural look, like she was talking about a neglected dog. I let it slide. Until now. That night, I pulled out the original survey my dad had kept locked in his office cabinet, yellowed but still legible. It showed clearly the drainage trench running across our lot and into a shared easement between our 2 properties. I compared it with the county plat map, and it matched. Karen's new fence wasn't just annoying, it was illegal. Still, I didn't want to escalate. The next morning, I knocked on her door. Karen opened it halfway, peeking from behind a wall of indoor plants. "Oh, Caleb," she said with a smile, too tight to be sincere. "Everything okay?" I noticed the new fencing along the back lots, I said, keeping my voice even. "It's blocking the original drainage trench. Water's already backing up into my yard." Her smile faltered for half a second, then returned like a reflex. That trench was unsightly. "We've initiated a beautification project. You'll thank me when your property value increases." I stared at her. "You're damming runoff. That trench exists to prevent flooding." She gave a little laugh. "Don't be so dramatic. It's a decorative garden barrier. If your lawn is pooling, maybe it's time to invest in better grading. I have city permits from 20 years ago that recognize that ditch as active infrastructure," I said. Karen's face changed then, just a flicker, but I saw it. A tightening in the jaw. "Well, if you have concerns, you're welcome to submit them in writing to the HOA board. We'll review them in the next monthly meeting. We're quite busy finalizing the new clubhouse." And just like that, the door shut. Back at home, I walked the length of the fence again, snapping pictures and measuring the depth of the pooled water. It had already reached 4 inches in some areas. The old trench was being overwhelmed. Worse, more rain was in the forecast. That night, I sent an email to the HOA's official address, attaching photos, scanned documents, and a detailed explanation of the original drainage path. I CC'd the county planning department and added a request to speak at the next HOA meeting. Days passed, no response. But the fines came instead. A white envelope from the HOA was taped to my front door. Inside, notice of violation. Unauthorized alteration of common area. They claimed the drainage ditch was an unpermitted excavation, and I was responsible for hazardous terrain management under Clause 5.3.2 of the Willow Ridge Landscaping Covenant. A $250 fine was due, in 7 days, with a threat of escalation if not paid. I read it 3 times, stunned. They were fining me for a trench that had existed long before the HOA, and which they had blocked. I refused to pay. The second notice came with a threat of legal action. The third came with pictures of my yard taken from the alley behind Karen's house, zoomed in on the trench like it was some kind of crime scene. And then it rained, just a little, but enough to make the trench overflow again. This time the water reached my crawlspace vents. If it kept going like this, it would start compromising the foundation. My father's voice echoed in my head. The land will always speak first, son. If you don't listen to it, you'll pay for it. I wasn't going to pay anyone else's price for ignorance. That weekend, I drove into town and printed every permit plat map and environmental compliance letter I could find at the records office. I knew I couldn't outshout Karen at the board meetings, but I could outdocument her. I'd seen men bluff and bully through bureaucracy before, but I also knew the paper trail never lied. And I had one more thing Karen didn't know about. I once helped redesign the flood mitigation systems for the entire northern half of Barrow County. She'd picked the wrong man to pick a fight with over water. The Willow Ridge HOA met every first Thursday of the month in the community clubhouse, a place that looked more like a country club than anything else. It sat proudly at the top of the hill with white stucco walls, faux marble columns, and a recently installed chandelier that was the subject of heated neighborhood gossip for months. I hadn't attended a meeting in over a year. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd grown tired of the smug smiles, the performative outrage, and the endless debates about mailbox paint and lawn edging. But this time was different. I had facts, I had evidence, and I had a rising pool of water threatening my foundation. When I walked into the room, the board was already seated at a long, polished table. Karen sat at the center, flanked by 2 board members I recognized only vaguely. One was Dan Tall, soft-spoken, had once led the landscaping committee, and now seemed permanently glued to his iPad. The other was Loretta, the treasurer, known for her hawk-like gaze and uncanny ability to detect unapproved seasonal wreaths. Karen looked up when I entered and offered that same clipped smile. Mr. Morrison, we weren't sure you'd RSVP. I ignored the jab. I'm here to speak during the homeowner concerns portion. Karen tapped her pen against the sign-in sheet. Please fill this out, and do keep your comments to under 3 minutes. I signed my name and took a seat near the back. The room filled slowly. Neighbors trickled in, most of them more interested in the free lemonade than the actual meeting. A few offered polite nods in my direction, others avoided eye contact. I knew how it looked, the reclusive veteran with too many maps and too much suspicion daring to challenge the HOA president, everyone called the heartbeat of Willow Ridge. When they finally called my name, I stood slowly and approached the board table with my folder of documents. I'm here, I began, because a long-standing drainage trench on my property has been intentionally blocked by a new HOA project. That blockage is causing flooding on my land. I have attached original plats, permits, and city drainage maps dating back to 1982, which prove that the trench predates this HOA and is legally protected as a natural runoff pathway. Karen didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands and nodded toward me with an expression so bland it bordered on insulting. I continued flipping through a set of laminated documents. I've also submitted photographs of the obstruction, as well as copies of the 2 recent fines issued against me for unauthorized excavation, which respectfully is both inaccurate and retaliatory. Dan looked up briefly from his iPad. Loretta squinted at my documents like they were written in another language. I'm formally requesting the immediate removal of the fence, obstructing the drainage, cancellation of the fines, and a full investigation into the project that caused this obstruction. Karen took a moment to compose herself, then smiled like she was hosting a brunch. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. The board appreciates your concern. However, I believe you'll find that the HOA's beautification efforts fall well within our landscaping rights, as outlined in the Covenant of 2004, Section 7. I opened my mouth to object, but she kept going, her tone shifting from polite to condescending in a single breath. Furthermore, the trench you refer to has no official recognition from the current municipal maps we reviewed last quarter, and therefore may not qualify as protected infrastructure. That's false, I said, holding up the stamped permit. This document is from the county archives. It's signed by the Civil Engineering Office. Karen didn't even look. With respect, we cannot verify the authenticity of independently produced documents during open forum. If you'd like to formally appeal the fines, you may do so through our legal liaison. I stared at her. I just told you my house is flooding. Karen tilted her head, eyebrows raised, as if I were a child in need of discipline. Caleb, we've received no complaints of flooding from any other residents. Perhaps the issue is isolated to your property due to insufficient maintenance. A soft murmur rose from the crowd. Someone whispered, "He's always fixing something over there." Another added, "Should have just joined the landscaping plan like everyone else." I closed the folder slowly. "You're making a mistake," I said quietly. Karen shrugged. "We'll take it under consideration." Next item on the agenda, clubhouse roof upgrades. "Dan, would you like to present the budget?" And just like that, my concerns vanished into the scripted rhythm of HOA bureaucracy. As I left, I felt a familiar chill, not from the air conditioning, but from the same cold weight I used to feel in the military when a superior ignored a red flag during pre-mission planning. I wasn't being heard. Worse, I was being silenced. Outside, I stood under the parking lot's security lights and looked back at the building. Storm clouds were gathering again in the west. My boots squished slightly on the lawn, already too wet for August. I knew the signs. The soil was saturated. The culverts weren't ready. If we got a big storm, this neighborhood built on gentle hills and manicured illusions was going to feel it. The next morning, I found another letter from the HOA in my mailbox. This one accused me of unauthorized contact with board members outside official hours and warned of potential escalation. I knew then I was no longer dealing with a disagreement. This was a cover-up, and it was escalating. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up with a flashlight walking the perimeter of my lot, checking the trench, watching the sky. The silence before a storm isn't always still. Sometimes it's crowded with warnings that no one wants to hear. But I was done waiting for someone to listen. The next few days unfolded like a slow-moving avalanche, silent at first, but unstoppable in its descent. Every morning I found something new taped to my door or stuffed into my mailbox, pink slips marked second notice violation, update, and final warning. The stack of envelopes grew faster than the rain clouds on the horizon. The latest was the most absurd yet. A $500 fine for unauthorized water redirection. According to the document, I had violated HOA guidelines by allowing storm water to be diverted onto common property in a manner inconsistent with neighborhood landscaping standards. The diversion they referred to my original drainage ditch now blocked thanks to Karen's so-called beautification initiative. I sat on my porch with the letter in hand, staring at the place where the trench used to empty into the shared easement. Water had no path forward anymore. It gathered near the base of my slope and curled toward the neighbor's backyard like a cornered animal looking for a way out. I'd placed a few sandbags as a stopgap, but even I knew that wouldn't hold if the real rains came. What bothered me more than the fines was the surveillance. I began noticing HOA volunteers walking slowly past my yard phone cameras, discreetly raised, pretending to take photos of flowers. Drones buzzed overhead at suspicious hours. One evening, I caught a guy, Kyle Karen's nephew, I think, peering over my fence, with a clipboard pretending to measure shrubs. When I confronted him, he said he was inspecting for creeping ivy violations. I knew harassment tactics when I saw them. This wasn't about plants. This was about pressure. They wanted me to stop pushing, to pay the fines, to shut up and disappear. Instead, I called my old friend Curtis, a former city planning inspector turned private consultant. We'd served together back in Iraq during the Fallujah rebuild phase. He was one of the few people I trusted implicitly. Curtis showed up the next morning in khakis and a faded polo notebook in hand. We walked the yard together, retracing the drainage route, measuring angles, noting soil saturation, and documenting everything. He frowned as he studied the new wooden fence. "This is bad," he muttered. "Whoever installed this didn't just block the runoff, they rerouted it onto unstable grading. See that swell forming under her flower bed? That's going to collapse." "She doesn't care," I said. "She thinks it's cosmetic." Curtis shook his head. "She's going to care when the water finds its own path. And believe me, it will." He helped me draft a technical report that included photos, GPS coordinates, and hydrological projections. We submitted it to the HOA formally via certified mail and email along with an attached legal notice stating my intent to seek damages if the obstruction wasn't removed within 14 days. Karen's reply came not as a letter, but as a public smear campaign. The next HOA newsletter included a special section titled Community Safety Alert. It warned residents about unlicensed modifications to stormwater routes by certain homeowners, calling them a potential liability threat. Though it didn't mention me by name, the map printed beside the paragraph showed an outline of my property shaded in red. Neighbors began whispering. One woman who used to wave when she jogged past now crossed to the opposite sidewalk. A man who once borrowed my hedge trimmer returned it silently without eye contact. The social isolation didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I'd never been here for the block parties or bake sales. But what did hurt, what struck like a blow, was seeing my father's land reduced to a legal battleground. His careful stonework labeled violations. His trench marked as hazardous infrastructure. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about memory legacy principle. 2 days later, I received notice that the HOA had hired outside legal counsel. I recognized the firm Banning & Shields, notorious in the area for siding with HOAs in property disputes, often winning through attrition rather than merit. They'd sue you over a wind chime, and win because they knew you couldn't afford to fight back. Except this time, I could. I wasn't wealthy, but I had no debt, a paid-off home, and more time than they realized. I also had friends in quiet places. Curtis connected me with a legal aid group specializing in property rights. They couldn't represent me formally, but they armed me with templates, statutes, and case law. I spent the next week preparing like it was deployment. My living room turned into a command center, maps taped to the walls, legal binders on the coffee table, a rolling whiteboard listing every code violation the HOA had committed during the beautification project. Karen may have had the board's votes and the public's ear, but I had the one ally that mattered more than either: the truth. One rainy afternoon, I watched from my back porch as water started pooling again, faster this time. The flower bed on Karen's side, the one Curtis had warned about, was beginning to sink slightly, the soil turning into a thick gray sludge. I snapped a picture every hour. By nightfall, the water had climbed halfway up her yard. Still, no one came to fix it. Then came the storm warning. Local news announced a tropical pressure system shifting suddenly inland. Flash flood advisories lit up on every weather app. Historic rainfall, they called it. The kind of storm they predicted every decade but only hit once in a generation. Karen didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down. That very evening, I received a final notice, a cease and desist order accusing me of interfering with community landscaping operations. It demanded I remove all illegal drainage modifications or face legal escalation. I read it 3 times dry-mouthed. She wanted me to destroy the last remaining path water had off my land. I folded the letter neatly, placed it on my dining table, and went to the shed. I grabbed my shovel. If they wanted a clean yard, they'd have to tear it from under the floodwater. I was done warning. It was time to dig. The ground trembled with the weight of the air before the storm arrived. It was the kind of thick electric stillness that made animals quiet and power lines hum. By the time I'd finished reinforcing the trench behind my property, the sky had turned a shade of purple I hadn't seen since the monsoon seasons I endured overseas. There's a certain rhythm to preparing for battle. You check every edge, every angle, twice. Then once more, because you know the first blow never comes the way you expect. This time, though, the enemy wasn't carrying a rifle, it was carrying water. I had started digging 2 nights prior after receiving that final cease and desist letter from the HOA. They gave me 72 hours to dismantle what they called an unapproved drainage modification. I laughed out loud when I read it. There was nothing new about that trench. The only modification was that I had cleared away the mud and roots their own fence had created. The irony didn't even need explaining. But I knew the legal game they were playing. They wanted to break me down with pressure, fine after fine, threat after threat. They wanted me to fear their power enough to fall silent. Instead, I bought sandbags. Then I drove an hour to an out-of-county contractor I'd worked with during my days in the Corps and picked up 6 concrete slats designed for culvert reinforcement. At night, under cover of darkness and headlamp, I rebuilt the eastern trench wall to direct the runoff eastward back toward its original path through the easement and out into the natural basin behind the woodline. Every motion I made was intentional, quiet, precise. I even installed a temporary floodgate, nothing fancy, just a steel plate braced by cinder blocks. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't HOA approved, but it would work. Curtis came by late Thursday evening and stood beside me at the edge of the property, arms crossed. "You're either a genius or about to be buried in HOA lawsuits," he said. I shrugged, maybe both. He paused, watching the clouds. "You've done what you could. You've overbuilt, reinforced everything. If this storm hits hard, your trench may be the only thing saving half this hill." "I didn't do it for them," I said flatly. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the reflection of our younger selves. The times when doing the right thing meant sticking your neck out alone. "I know," he said quietly, "but it might still save them anyway." By Friday, the storm was no longer a probability. It was a certainty. The National Weather Service had named it Storm Iris. Unexpected. Fast-moving. A collision of pressure systems spinning directly inland and gaining strength. Iris wasn't just bringing rain. It was bringing fury. That morning, Karen held an emergency HOA meeting in the clubhouse. I didn't attend. I'd heard from a neighbor, one of the few still friendly, that she had instructed volunteers to monitor any suspicious water-related activities and report unauthorized modifications immediately. She even threatened to contact code enforcement if anyone attempted to redirect runoff in a way that endangered community aesthetics. Community aesthetics. I could have screamed. Instead, I did one final walk of my yard. The trench was ready. The slope angled, the gate secure. I'd placed wooden stakes every 6 feet with color-coded markers to measure flood depth. A GoPro camera was mounted to the back porch beam set to time-lapse. That night, the rain began. At first, it was gentle, almost a tease, a soft tapping on the roof, rhythmic and slow, like a lullaby. But around midnight, the rhythm changed. The rain thickened, turned metallic. You could hear it drilling into the ground, a percussion of endless drops. Thunder didn't roll, it cracked, sharp and sudden like slaps to the earth. At 2:12 a.m., the floodgate opened for the first time. I watched from the back porch as the trench took in water, funneled it through, and discharged it past the old fencing line, right where the original basin lay. It worked. I could almost feel my father watching, nodding in approval from wherever he rested. But across the fence where Karen's flower bed now sat, a different story was unfolding. Water wasn't draining. It was pooling. The wooden fence acted like a dam, trapping runoff from multiple homes and backing it into her manicured lawn. Her flower bed caved in first, the earth collapsing inward like a sinkhole. I heard a metallic clang, likely a buried irrigation pipe snapping. By 3:00 a.m., water was knee-high in Karen's yard. And still the rain came down. I tried calling the county emergency line to report the obstruction, but they were overwhelmed. Over a dozen neighborhoods were reporting flash floods. Roads were closing. Power lines were down. It was chaos. By dawn, Willow Ridge looked like a river delta. From my second-story window, I watched as the front entrance to the HOA clubhouse, built on the flattest stretch of land near the lowest basin, disappeared under 3 feet of brown water. Karen's million-dollar vision submerged. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I just stood there, hand on the window pane, feeling the weight of inevitability press against my chest. She had been warned. Not just by me, but by the land itself. By 7 a.m., there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, soaked to the skin. Her signature white cardigan was clinging to her like a limp rag, her hair matted, makeup gone, eyes wide and unblinking. "Your trench," she whispered. "It's still open." I said nothing. We need to drain the water off the hill before it reaches the foundation of the clubhouse. It's spreading toward the main hall. I didn't know it could happen this fast." She looked like a child caught in her own lie, finally realizing the story she'd built couldn't hold under pressure. "Please," she added, her voice cracking. I stepped aside. She followed me silently into the backyard, her feet squishing in the mud with every step. When we reached the edge of the trench, she stared at it like it was a portal to a world she'd refused to believe existed. "This saved your house?" she asked. "No," I replied. "This saved my father's legacy." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she collapsed onto the damp grass shoulders, heaving mascara, bleeding into the rain. There was nothing left to say. The water had spoken. By the time the sun broke through the morning haze, it no longer felt like the same neighborhood. Willow Ridge had transformed into something surreal, a quiet catastrophe, wrapped in suburban vinyl siding. The storm was over, but it left behind a swollen silence. No birds, no cars, just the creaking of warped fences and the soft lap of floodwater brushing up against patio furniture and garden gnomes. I stood on my back porch, boots caked in mud, arms crossed as I watched the aftermath unfold like the opening scene of a war film. The trench behind my property was still flowing, a narrow river cutting a clean path downhill. Everything I had built, the reinforced walls, the channeling gate, the sandbag, supports it had all held. My land was muddy, sure, but dry where it needed to be. The crawl space was dry, the foundation untouched. The basement sump pump hadn't even kicked in. Karen's side, however, was another matter. Her backyard looked like a shallow pond, water lapping against the back wall of her home. Her expensive outdoor seating set, wicker with bright cushions, was half submerged like a sinking ship's last breath. And just beyond that, down the hill, the HOA clubhouse stood marooned like a stranded whale. The parking lot had disappeared entirely. The lower level was underwater. What got me the most was the silence. No HOA patrols, no leaf blower noise, no yoga class music drifting from the clubhouse sound system. Just wind and wetness. Nature had reclaimed its place, and it didn't care about property values or newsletter aesthetics. I watched as a few neighbors stepped out of their homes cautiously, like prairie dogs poking their heads above ground. Most of them looked stunned. Some were barefoot, walking through ankle-deep water to retrieve trash bins and patio chairs that had floated away in the night. One man across the street held a rake like a spear, as if the water might still fight back. And then Karen emerged. She stepped out onto her porch like she was walking into a battlefield. Her white robe was dirty, her hair tied back in a defeated ponytail, and she carried a clipboard. A reflex more than anything else, I suppose. I watched as she took a few tentative steps into her yard, wading through the water, surveying the damage with slow, stiff movements. I wanted to feel triumphant. I really did. But as I watched her stand there, knee-deep in the consequences of her arrogance, I only felt a quiet ache. Because I had warned her. I had warned all of them. But now it was too late for warnings. Around mid-morning, emergency crews began arriving. Pickup trucks with county logos. A team of city engineers in neon vests. They parked at the higher elevation streets, then walked in knee-high in boots and gear. One of them, a short woman with sharp eyes and a soaked clipboard, came directly to my door. "Caleb Morrison," she asked. I nodded. "That's me." She looked around, impressed. "Your lot's the only one on this side with functional runoff. Everything else is a swamp." I gave a tired half smile. "I used to be Army Corps of Engineers. Old habits." "Smart habits," she replied. "You got a minute to walk us through your drainage setup? We're trying to trace water flow and identify where things went wrong." I didn't hesitate. I led her and two others through the trench, showing the modifications I'd made, pointing out where the original runoff route had been severed. I showed them the remains of Karen's illegal fence, now partially collapsed and floating like driftwood, and the flower bed that had become a sinkhole. They took pictures, jotted notes, measured elevation and soil saturation. "We've already had 3 homeowners mention the HOA's recent landscaping project," the woman said. "Apparently, they rerouted a number of swales without city approval." I nodded. "They didn't just reroute them, they blocked them." She looked up sharply. "You have documentation." I handed her a USB drive. It had everything: photos, timestamps, emails, my certified letter, Curtis's technical report. She looked at it like it was gold. "This helps a lot," she said. "Honestly, this entire development might have dodged worse damage if more people had what you built." As she left, Karen approached from her side yard, water squelching with each step. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she held her clipboard like a shield. She waited until the city team was out of earshot, then looked at me, with a fragile attempt at control. "This was an extreme weather event," she said, voice brittle. "No one could have predicted this kind of rainfall." I said nothing. "Insurance might not cover it all," she added. "But I'm putting together a report, a community claim. If you'd like to contribute your findings to help the board." "I'm not helping the board," I said finally, breaking the silence. "I tried that. You ignored me. You fined me. You accused me of creating danger when I was trying to prevent one." Karen blinked, her posture faltering. "You blocked the one thing that could have saved this neighborhood," I continued. "You didn't care about runoff or infrastructure. You cared about flower beds and newsletter photos. And now half this development is underwater. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I'm turning over everything to the city, I said. They're already investigating. You might want to prepare for that instead of another community email blast. Karen looked down, her fingers tightening on the clipboard. I was trying to improve the community, she said almost to herself. No, I said. You were trying to control it. And with that, I walked away. Later that afternoon, I stood at the edge of the property, again Curtis beside me, the storm's scent still clinging to the air. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Hell of a week, he said. I nodded. You think they'll finally listen now? I shrugged. Doesn't matter. He raised an eyebrow. No. I looked at the trench flowing quietly, steadily, just like it always had. They don't have to listen, I said. The water already told them everything. In the days that followed the storm, the mood in Willow Ridge shifted from shock to something quieter, shame. The kind of heavy, unspoken recognition that crawls into people's eyes when they realize they've ignored every red flag that was waving right in front of them. And Karen, she wore that weight like a soggy crown. I saw her the morning after the city engineers left, wandering near the clubhouse ruins, with the same clipboard she'd clutched even as the water rose to her knees. But this time there was no smugness in her posture, no tight smile. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step took convincing. I might have felt sorry for her if I hadn't known how many opportunities she'd had to change course. The clubhouse was a total loss. The insurance agents had come through cameras, flashing, shaking their heads. The damage was classified as preventable in preliminary reports, which meant the HOA might not see a dime. Karen didn't speak to anyone that day. She just hovered around the wreckage like a ghost of bad decisions. It was surreal. Watching the very person who had fined me, threatened me, tried to ostracize me, now adrift in the ruins of her own making. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. Like the neighborhood no longer orbited her gravity. But it wasn't until the emergency town hall that things truly cracked. The HOA board scrambled to organize it, probably hoping to save face to get ahead of the whispers that were now turning into open conversations. They set it in the only dry space left, large enough, the high school gymnasium up the hill. I wasn't planning to attend. I'd said my piece. I had nothing more to prove, but Curtis called me, told me I needed to be there. Not for revenge, for closure. So I went. The place was packed. Not just residents, but reporters too. A couple of city council aides. Some guys from the county emergency response unit. Even a man I recognized from the district attorney's office, leaning against the bleachers with arms crossed. Karen took the stage late. She looked drained. Gone were the pearls. The perfectly tailored blazers. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, her blonde hair pulled back without the usual polish. She stepped up to the microphone, cleared her throat, and tried to begin. I'd like to address the recent. A man in the crowd cut her off. Address the fact you flooded our homes. A murmur of agreement rippled through the seats. Karen blinked, clearly rattled. This storm was unprecedented. We did the best we could given the information. You blocked a legal drainage path, someone else shouted. My basement's ruined. My insurance denied the claim. Karen held up a hand, but her voice cracked. I understand you're upset. I watched her closely. She was unraveling. We had landscaping goals, she tried again. We believed the changes would benefit the community long term. They benefited you, an older woman snapped. Your home had new sod and sprinkler upgrades. What about ours? Karen was visibly shaking now. Her hands trembled on the podium. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't mean for... But no one was listening anymore. Loretta, the treasurer, stood up in the second row. Karen, with all due respect, she said, her voice cold but steady. You didn't consult the board on that fence project. You pushed it through as an emergency measure for beautification. You ignored Caleb's letters. You fined him into silence. And now the clubhouse is gone. The room went completely silent. Karen looked at me, just for a second. And in that moment, I saw something raw in her face. Fear, regret, maybe even shame. But mostly, I saw a woman who'd finally reached the limits of her ability to spin a narrative. She stepped back from the microphone. And then right there in front of the whole room, she began to cry. Not polite tears, not performative sniffles. She broke down. Her clipboard clattered to the floor. Her shoulders heaved. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, uncontrolled, desperate. People looked around, unsure whether to comfort or condemn. And still no one moved. She had ruled through intimidation and charm. Now stripped of both, she had nothing left to stand on. It wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like one. But it was a turning point. The board announced later that evening that Karen would be stepping down as HOA president, effective immediately. An interim leadership committee would be formed to handle storm recovery efforts with representatives from each block. I wasn't surprised when one of the committee members knocked on my door 2 days later. "Mr. Morrison," the young woman said, "we were hoping you'd consider joining the advisory panel for infrastructure and environmental safety." After everything you did, I didn't answer right away. I looked past her out at the trench that had saved my home, the rain having left it more defined than ever. "I'll think about it," I said, because I needed space. I needed quiet. But more than that, I needed time to understand what healing would actually look like for this neighborhood, for myself, even for Karen. Later that week, I found a handwritten note tucked inside my mailbox. No envelope, no signature. Just shaky cursive that read, "You were right, I'm sorry for everything." I knew who it was from. I folded it carefully and slid it between the pages of my permit folder, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes people learn too late, but sometimes too late is still better than never. A week after the emergency town hall, Willow Ridge was still soggy. The sun had returned, but its warmth couldn't erase the watermarks left on fences, the sludge crusted along sidewalks, or the smell of mildew that now lingered near every vent. But something else had begun to spread through the neighborhood too, an energy that hadn't been here before. Whispers of change, eyes beginning to open, and not just toward Karen, but toward the whole structure that let her run wild for years. That's when the investigators showed up. I was repairing the side gate when the city inspector I'd spoken with earlier, Sasha, returned this time, with 2 colleagues and a small drone. They introduced themselves, quickly flashed credentials, and got right to work. One of them unspooled measuring tape across the rear property lines, while another launched the drone to map elevation shifts and drainage flow. It hovered and zipped in tight loops over our block, capturing images of sediment trails, fence angles, and erosion spots that, to the trained eye, told a complete story. Sasha approached me again, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I need you to walk me through everything again, as completely as possible. We're compiling evidence for a full code violation review." I took a deep breath, nodded, and began. I pointed out the trench's original route, where it had discharged since the 1980s. How the fence Karen installed created a dam-like blockage, how her landscaped flower bed exacerbated pressure at the fence line and rerouted water sideways into neighboring yards. I showed them where the water finally broke through, ripping open part of the easement and flooding into the clubhouse's foundation. I showed them the soaked ground where I had removed the sandbags only after the worst passed. I even gave them timestamps for my GoPro camera. Sasha was quiet the whole time, but I could feel her mind working. When I finished, she flipped to a fresh page and asked, "Did the HOA ever file for a drainage modification permit?" "No," I said. "Not to my knowledge, and definitely not with neighbor consultation." "That's a serious violation," she muttered. One of her colleagues returned from Karen's yard with a piece of sod in his gloved hand. They installed this over compacted clay, zero permeability. All the runoff backed straight into the house. "Of course it did," Sasha sighed. I followed her gaze as it landed on the clubhouse, where the cleanup crews had now turned to demolition prep. Part of the stucco had cracked and peeled. One of the support beams was visibly sagging. Someone had painted a red X on the front wall earlier that morning. The damage was structural and permanent. That night, I received an email from the city's Municipal Compliance Division confirming that the Willow Ridge HOA was under formal investigation. The charges included unauthorized modification of drainage infrastructure, failure to file environmental impact assessments, and negligence contributing to property damage. The email was sterile, as all bureaucratic messages are, but I reread it 4 times, feeling something stir in my chest that wasn't quite satisfaction, but something close. Accountability. Curtis called me not long after. "City's launching a case," he said without preamble. "You may be asked to testify." "I figured," I replied. "You ready for that?" "I've stood in front of generals and Senate aides with less on my side," I said. "Yeah, I'm ready." What surprised me most was how quickly the neighbors started changing too. A man I barely knew, Ted, I think, showed up with 2 six-packs and an apology. I voted for her every time he confessed. I thought she had a vision, you know. But I see it now. You weren't trying to be difficult. You were trying to save us. I didn't say much, just handed him a beer and nodded. The next day, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, whose yard had suffered serious flooding, knocked on my door with a Tupperware full of banana bread and a copy of her insurance rejection letter. They said it was due to neighborhood infrastructure failure, she said, eyes damp. Can I add my name to the complaint? I gave her the legal aid group's contact info and a slice of her own banana bread. Within 72 hours, 10 more residents reached out. What had once been a fortress of HOA obedience had begun to crack the fear that held people compliant, now replaced by frustration, by truth, by the sight of their living rooms ankle-deep in stormwater. Then on a gray Monday morning, I got the call. It was Sasha again. Her voice had that clipped efficiency of someone trying not to sound urgent. We've obtained an internal HOA document through a resident board member, she said. It's a planning memo from 3 months before the storm, hand-signed by Karen, outlining the decision to block the trench despite being advised it was non-compliant and might increase runoff risk. My jaw tightened. They knew. They knew. And they acted anyway. That document changed everything. The city moved quickly to expand their probe into civil liability. Insurance agencies sent in their own investigators, and by the end of the week, a cease and desist order was posted on the clubhouse front door right below the red X. Karen was served an official subpoena the next morning. She didn't fight it. She didn't have the strength anymore. When I saw her again, it was from a distance. She was packing the trunk of her Lexus with boxes. No clipboard, no pearls. Just a woman folding sweaters into luggage in a neighborhood that no longer bowed when she passed. Part of me expected her to glance up. She didn't. And maybe that was for the best. I stood on my porch arms, crossed again, trench still intact. The storm was long gone, but its imprint remained on the land, on the people, and maybe most of all on me. Because something had shifted. And it wasn't just water levels or public opinion. It was power. For the first time, the balance had tipped. And the ones who once silenced truth were now answering for it, one investigation, one document, one neighbor at a time. By the time the interim HOA committee officially replaced Karen, I had become a familiar name in city council meetings, zoning subcommittees, and even a few news blurbs. Not by choice, but because sometimes when you're the first person to say, this is wrong, and the flood proves you right, people start to listen. The shift was palpable. It began with a letter. Not a threat, not a fine, not a clipboard-taped notice, but a letter of acknowledgement signed by the interim committee chair, Evelyn Brooks. She had been one of the silent ones at past meetings, always in the corner taking notes, never speaking. But now she was leading the charge to repair what Karen had broken. The letter read, Mr. Morrison, on behalf of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association Interim Committee, we would like to extend an apology for the events leading to the storm damage and the failure of our leadership to properly assess and act upon critical infrastructure concerns raised by residents, specifically your documented reports and warnings. We are establishing a neighborhood environmental oversight board, and we would be honored if you would consider serving as its first appointed chair. It was more than I'd expected, and yet it felt right. Still, I didn't say yes immediately. Curtis and I sat on the back porch the next evening, drinking coffee and watching the trench still gently flowing along the edge of my yard. The soil had begun healing, native grasses sprouting where the storm had scraped the land raw. Nature always came back if you gave it space and time. You going to take the position, he asked, sipping. Maybe, I said. Feels weird. Not sure if it's a peace offering or just damage control. Both can be true, he said. But it's a seat at the table now, a real one. You earned that. He was right, and I knew it. But I also knew the HOA couldn't just patch this with good intentions. The clubhouse had been condemned. 5 homes were still unlivable. Over 30 insurance claims were pending, and Karen's legal case was now moving into formal discovery. The residents deserved more than a handshake and a new committee. They needed change. So I agreed on one condition. I requested that the Neighborhood Environmental Oversight Board be formed as an independent advisory group with full access to HOA records, voting participation in land use decisions, and authority to submit formal objections to any construction or modification plans. Not a symbolic board, a real one. To my surprise, the interim committee agreed. And just like that, I was no longer an outcast. I was part of the reform. It didn't happen overnight. In fact, the next few weeks were exhausting. We met 3 times a week sometimes in the library meeting room, sometimes in residents' garages, with extension cords and fold-out tables. We reviewed past HOA spending records permits and minutes everything Karen had buried under beautification projects and private contractor deals. What we found was worse than I imagined. Unapproved landscaping expenditures. Contracts awarded to Karen's niece's husband without bids. Emergency tree removals where no permits were filed. And of course, the drainage enhancement project that started it all documented only in an internal memo with Karen's initials scribbled across it. We packaged it all, and we brought it to the city. This time I wasn't alone. At the next public meeting, I stood beside Evelyn Curtis Loretta, who'd resigned from the original board but returned to assist, and 5 homeowners who'd been flooded out of their properties. Our presentation was methodical, factual, and irrefutable. By the end of the 2-hour hearing, the city voted to freeze all further HOA-managed infrastructure projects pending a full third-party audit. That vote unanimous was the real turning point. HOA power unchecked and insulated for years was now accountable. But there was more. 3 weeks later, a citywide newsletter announced that the Barrow County Civil Engineering Review Board had selected Willow Ridge to pilot a new community resident joint planning initiative. I was listed as a citizen advisor. My job to help develop sustainable drainage models for similar HOA-governed neighborhoods, using the mistakes here as a cautionary foundation. It felt surreal. To think I started all this by trying to keep water out of my crawl space. Then came the hearing notice. Karen's formal hearing was scheduled for the following month. The city attorney's office had filed a case citing negligence abuse of HOA authority and direct causation of damage to community infrastructure. She would not only face civic penalties, but likely lose all claims to HOA assets, including her board privileges, voting rights, and in some cases even her insurance coverage due to breach of responsibility clauses. I didn't plan to attend, not because I didn't care, but because I'd already seen what I needed to see. Karen wasn't in charge anymore. The land was. The community was. Weeks passed, and with them came changes that felt like spring pushing up through the mud. Kids played near the stormwater basin again, now properly cleared and labeled. The HOA newsletters, once bloated with rule reminders and threats, were replaced with community spotlights and progress updates. Loretta launched a monthly town walkabout where residents could suggest improvements in person. And me, I got back to my porch, my trench, my quiet. But there were visitors now. People who once scowled at my yard now asked about native plantings, about runoff control, about how to make their slopes look like mine. I showed them not out of pride, but out of something deeper: stewardship. Because the land remembers. It remembers who listened when it spoke, and it remembers who didn't. So when the first spring rain came gentle and slow, I stood in the doorway with a coffee in hand, listening to the sound of it dancing across my roof and down into the trench. Everything was flowing again. Finally, the news came quietly. No big headline, no sirens or breaking coverage. Just a short notice on page 4 of the local paper. Former Willow Ridge HOA President Karen Whitmore resigns from all civic positions amid investigation. But those of us who lived through the flood, who smelled the rot in our drywall and saw the water lines tattooed across our baseboards, we knew what that headline meant. We knew it was the fall. Karen's hearing had moved swiftly once the city received the internal memo I'd helped the new committee obtain. That document, the one bearing her signature and the language, despite runoff concerns, was the smoking gun. Once the city linked that to the flooding damage, and once insurance companies got involved, the rest unfolded like dominoes. She didn't even contest it. According to what Loretta later told me, Karen walked into the closed-door hearing with just one attorney, a beige folder, and none of her old fire. No denial, no defense, just a simple tired voice admitting she had misjudged the scope and consequences of the project. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't remorse either. It was resignation of title control and narrative. The HOA board officially stripped her of all voting power pending civil liability review. The city filed a negligence complaint. The insurance companies began coordinating subrogation claims for every flooded homeowner who had filed damages against the HOA itself. Her influence, once feared and felt on every street in Willow Ridge, vanished in a single week. And the neighborhood! It began to breathe again. Without Karen orchestrating every bulletin and patrol, things started to loosen. Lawns grew a little freer. Children's bikes left in driveways overnight weren't tagged with warning slips. Even the community email tone changed from passive-aggressive mandates to open conversations. But change always stirs resistance too. I noticed a few of her loyalists holding out neighbors who still mowed diagonally in perfect stripes and snubbed me at the mailboxes. People like Roy Garland, who once barked at me for planting tomatoes too close to the property line, now glared from behind his curtains when I walked by. But their silence was no longer power. Because now every meeting, every motion, every vote, they happened in public. And people showed up. Not just the loud ones, the quiet ones too. The ones who had long accepted the HOA as an untouchable force now leaned forward in chairs raised, hands offered, thoughts. I saw the power of that one night in particular. We were sitting in a town hall reviewing upcoming repairs to the stormwater basin near the southern boundary. An engineer showed diagrams, and at one point, Evelyn, the interim HOA chair, paused to ask if any residents had input on the redesign. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then from the back row, a voice cleared. It was Mrs. Jensen, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s, who'd never said more than a hello to me in 6 years. Her house had flooded worse than anyone's, and she'd been living with her daughter ever since. She raised her hand slowly. "I know it's not my place," she began, "but that corner of the basin has always collected leaves too fast. My husband used to clear it every fall. Before he passed, he told me if it ever got blocked, we'd be in trouble." He was right. The room went still. "Could we maybe put a grate there or something? Just so it doesn't clog so easy." The engineer nodded thoughtfully. Evelyn wrote it down. Someone in the front murmured, "That's a good idea." And just like that, a woman who once felt invisible became part of the fix. That's what Karen never understood. It was never about control. It was about belonging. She had spent years building a system where people were too afraid to speak, too worn down, to challenge, too conditioned to obey. But when the storm came, when nature leveled the playing field suddenly, everyone was equal again. Water didn't care about titles or clipboard citations, and now neither did we. One afternoon, as I was trimming back the blackberry bushes near the trench, I saw her again. Karen. She was walking slowly down the edge of the neighborhood with no car, no entourage, no purse dogs in tow. She wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the fact that she looked older, now smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. Stripped of the power she had wielded like a sword for so long. She didn't come near. She didn't speak. But she paused at the corner across from my lot. Looked at the trench, the stone lining, the reinforced sidewalls, the way it curved naturally, elegantly, following the land. And for just a moment, our eyes met. I didn't wave, I didn't nod, but I didn't look away either. She stood there a second longer, then walked on. It wasn't redemption, but it was something else. Recognition. Weeks later, the trench was officially declared a protected historic runoff path by the city. It would now be maintained as public utility infrastructure exempt from HOA interference and cataloged into the county's environmental records. When the letter arrived confirming it, I stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the channel not with pride but with peace. What once had been a battleground was now a blueprint, not just for water, but for people. Because here's what no one teaches you when you buy a home. In an HOA-ruled neighborhood, you're not just buying square footage and granite countertops. You're buying into a system. And if that system is broken, if the wrong hands are steering it, it can feel like drowning in broad daylight with no one throwing a rope. Until someone does. And once one rope is thrown, more follow. Karen fell, but in her wake something far more valuable rose. Us. The neighbors. The land. The truth. The rains returned in early spring, not a storm this time, but the kind that fell gently for days, soaking the earth without drama. For the first time in years, no one in Willow Ridge feared it. That morning, I stood barefoot in the backyard, coffee steaming in my hand, as I watched the trench carry the rainfall downhill in a perfect ribbon. The water was clear, confident, alive. The stones I'd laid, the slopes I'd studied, the way the land curved, everything worked exactly as it should. There was no panic, no flooding, no damage control, just harmony. But what moved me more than the water was the sound coming from behind me. Children laughing. 3 kids from the west side of the block were chasing each other along the grass line, where the trench flowed, boots splashing in the overflow that fanned harmlessly into a designated catchment. Their mother, Laura, I think, stood nearby, with her arms crossed, smiling, not scolding them. Just watching like I was. 6 months ago, this same slope had been Karen's private flower bed project with ropes blocking access and volunteers placing markers about turf protection zones. Now it was just land, living land, and everyone's, that I realized was the real victory, not Karen's fall. Not the civil suit win that came weeks later when the city officially fined the HOA $92,000 in negligence damages. Not even the policy change that followed mandating environmental assessments on every new HOA landscaping project in the county. It was this: children playing in the rain again, life flowing, neighbors waving, no one looking over their shoulder for violations or photos or fines. The healing happened in layers, some visible, some not. For some residents, it began with the community garden project we started near the southern basin. We'd repurposed the land adjacent to the flood zone using compost from storm debris and planting native crops: tomatoes, okra, kale. Curtis built the raised beds himself, and Mrs. Jensen painted signs for each row with bright, crooked letters. Others healed through action. Loretta, for one, became the strongest voice on the new board, vowing to make every financial record public and ensuring no president could ever operate with unchecked authority again. She even convinced the city to host quarterly HOA education seminars for residents. But for me, the healing came more quietly. It came in the form of solitude that wasn't lonely, in the soft shuffle of gravel under my boots each time I inspected the trench, in the neighbors who started waving first, in Evelyn, now full-time board chair, dropping off blueprints for runoff models and asking for my input sincerely, not as a formality, and in Karen. Strange as it might sound, she became a part of the healing too. I didn't see her often after the hearing. She'd sold her house quietly below market value, and word was she'd moved 2 towns over. But one day, while driving back from the hardware store, I saw her again standing outside a modest craftsman home near the post office, placing mulch around the base of a young tree. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and chose not to react, but I slowed just enough to take her in. No clipboard, no crowd, no control. Just a woman tending to earth, and maybe in her own way, tending to the parts of herself she'd buried under rules and power and fear. I didn't need revenge, I didn't want it, because the land had spoken, and it had done so more powerfully than any speech I could give. The day we dedicated the new rain garden built on the edge of what was once the HOA's prized rose courtyard, the entire block came out. Children, seniors, families, couples. Someone brought lemonade. Someone else brought folding chairs. And the city council representative gave a short speech about resilience through community. But the part that stayed with me was when Sasha, the city inspector, who'd been with me from the beginning, handed me a plaque. It was small, modest. The engraving read, "In recognition of Caleb Morrison for listening to the land when no one else would." I didn't cry, but I did close my eyes just for a moment and imagined my father standing there in his old work boots, nodding quietly. After everyone left, I stayed behind, walking the perimeter of the new rain garden, my fingers trailing across the edges of the native plants we'd placed by hand. Blue flag iris, switchgrass, buttonbush. Plants that thrived not in spite of water, but because of it. That's what we were now. A community that didn't just survive the flood, but learned from it. We had stopped fearing the rain, and in doing so, we'd stopped fearing each other. Now every time it rains, I still step outside. I watch the trench not out of worry, but out of reverence. I feel the earth breathe beneath me, the way it channels and cradles and moves. And I remember that justice doesn't always come like lightning. It can flow slowly like water, finding its way home. This isn't just where I live anymore. It's where I belong. And finally, after everything, it's ours.